a name. When Shakespeare had Juliet tell Romeo that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, he seemed to imply that names didn't matter very much. But many of you would probably disagree. So would linguists. We've uncovered a wealth of linguistic richness in names. In the next 10 minutes, I'll show you that names show subtle patterns and regularities, and that our behavior when naming is governed by unwritten, intuitive rules. In this respect, names are a lot like language. We aren't explicitly taught to speak our native language. Native English speakers aren't ever explicitly instructed that an English sentence has to have the subject first, and then the verb, and then the object, and not the verb first, and then the subject, and then the object, which is how sentences are made in Welsh, for instance. And nobody ever sits us down and teaches us that Gydin could never be a legitimate word of English, but we probably all agree that it couldn't. Somehow native speakers pick up these rules of language intuitively. I'll show you that there are things we intuitively know about names, too, and that these can have important social consequences. One of these things is what linguists call sound symbolism. This is the way specific, minute sounds of language can be associated with particular meanings. For instance, across languages, certain sounds tend to be associated with small things, while other sounds tend to be associated with big things. Examples of small associated sounds are the vowel E, as in cheese, and the vowel I, as in lit. Examples of big associated sounds are the vowel oo, as in choose, and the vowel ah, as in lot. These sounds tend to show up in the words we use for particular concepts. Hence, we talk about teeny weeny, little and petite things with the E and I sounds, versus huge, large, or grande things with the oo and ah sounds. These associations between sound and size show up in naming too. A 2018 study by researchers in Japan found that Pokemon characters whose names had small-sounding vowels like E or I at the beginning tended to be smaller and lighter than Pokemon characters whose names had large-sounding vowels like oo, o, or ah at the beginning. Hence, we have Pikachu with an E, measuring in at a little over a foot and 13 pounds, according to official Pokemon statistics on height and weight, and yes, they exist, and yes, I looked them up, versus Snorlax with an aw at over 6 feet tall and weighing half a ton. Things you didn't expect to learn with a PhD in linguistics. A 2004 study published in the Journal of Consumer Research found that people would rather buy a fictitious ice cream brand when it was called Frosh than when it was called Frisch, presumably because the ah sound connotes bigness, richness, and heaviness, desirable attributes for an ice cream, in a way that the I sound doesn't. Nobody ever teaches us that these sounds have these associations, and yet people choose names in ways that are very consistent with them. Something else we intuitively know about names is how to make nicknames from them. The Jessicas in your life may go by Jess or Jessie, and the Thomases may go by Tom. But I can bet you've never met a Jessica who goes by Jet, or Jessic, or Ka, or a Thomas who goes by Amos. Even though these are portions of the full name, just like Jess and Tom are. Why is this? Creating nicknames in English follows a consistent pattern. There are rules concerning which portion of the full name can make a legitimate nickname, rules that were never taught. The rules are different in different languages. In French, Thomas will go by Toto. But what's the same is that no one ever sits speakers down and teaches them how to make nicknames, and yet we pick up the patterns and we know intuitively what makes a good nickname and what doesn't. Given names also show patterns, and those patterns have been found to change in predictable, directional ways over time. This is another way in which names are similar to language more generally. Language is constantly changing. Ways of saying things are progressively becoming out of date and getting replaced with new ones. This is obvious in the case of slang, but it happens at an even more subtle level too. For instance, since the 1940s, Based on the text in millions of books digitized by Google, people have been progressively dropping the of in the phrase out of the window. So this graph is showing you the rate at which out of the window is used out of all 4-word phrases in all the millions of books digitized by Google from the 1800s to the present day, versus the rate at which out the window is used out of all 3-word phrases in all of those books digitized by Google. And what it's showing you is that you're now much more likely to read that someone looked out the window than that they looked out of the window. This isn't something that we're explicitly taught, and most of us don't notice it happening, but my students all agree when I ask them that out the window comes more naturally to them than out of the window. The language is changing right under our noses. The names people give their children change in patterned ways too. Because in the US, people are generally very free in the names they can choose to give to their infants, naming is subject to whims of style and taste. This means that by studying decades of birth records, linguists can observe changes in naming patterns, just like studying decades of books can show us changes in how we construct phrases. Birth records have shown us, for instance, that many names show a V-shaped pattern of popularity. Several names that were very popular in the early 1900s, as measured by how they were ranked out of all the names given to babies in a year, progressively lost popularity over the course of the 20th century, but have undergone recent resurgences. So some examples of those names are shown here: Lillian, Grace, and Leo. These names seem to be showing trends that skip generations. So people naming babies in the middle of the 20th century associate them probably too much with their parents and grandparents, but by the end of the 20th century, they've been out of fashion long enough that they can show a comeback. Trends in naming get even more subtle than this too, zeroing in on specific sounds. Many name enthusiasts have noticed a recent dramatic uptick in the popularity of names given to male babies that end with N. This graph shows that at the beginning of the 20th century, fewer than 5 of the topmost 50 popular names given to male babies ended with N, but by the 2000s, nearly half of them did. Examples include Mason, Ethan, and Aiden. Just like nobody told us to start dropping the of in out of the window, nobody went around telling parents to give their babies names with a particular sound. Name change, like language change, happens subconsciously, but it happens constantly. Some names, like Brittany, are so of a moment that, as the statisticians at 538.com have pointed out, you can make a highly educated guess at how old a woman is just by learning that her name is Brittany. And that brings me to my last point. We make snap judgments about people based on their names, just like we make snap judgments about people based on how they speak. These judgments are often influenced by our biases and prejudices, and this can have real consequences. A 2012 study found that identical resumes submitted to apply for a job as a manager of a science lab were rated lower when the name on them was Jennifer rather than John. And a 2004 study found that identical resumes submitted to administrative and sales jobs were rated lower when the name on them was one that birth records show to be preferentially given by African American parents, like Keisha or Jamal, compared to resumes with a control name, like Emily or Greg. In the same way that our language is shaped by factors of our identity, like our gender, our ethnicity, and our social class background, so are our names. And as long as society discriminates against people for those characteristics, names will be a target of that discrimination too. But recognizing that language and naming, these essential attributes of our humanity, are subject to discrimination is the first step to combating it. So, what's in a name? A whole lot more than Shakespeare let on. Thank you.